The lives of British officer Banastre Tarleton and Continental officer Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee are saturated with drama and controversy. Both men were accused of cruel acts during wartime, and both men returned home after the war, leaving chaos and emotional turmoil in their wake. But why? Why do we remember them so differently? And how were they similar? This video is going to discuss some of the controversial aspects of both of these figures. We want to stress that it doesn't devalue either man, and we want to stress that these men had both positive and negative qualities. We are all human and we are all flawed. And this video is going to showcase how some of these flaws between the two men truly drew parallels to each other. We're going to start at the very beginning. We're going to go through broad biographies of both men and really understand where they came from, where they went, and how their careers impacted those around them. Colonel Henry Lee came from one of the oldest families in Virginia. Their estate, called Lee Sylvania, was the crown jewel of their properties. The family possessed over 30,000 acres in Virginia by the time Lee would come into control of the family estates. Now, Tarleton also came from wealth, although comparing it to Lee's family is a little bit difficult. Banastre Tarleton was raised by wealthy parents who were heavily involved in the Liverpool shipping industry. His father served as a mayor of the city for a time, and the family's wealth allowed them to purchase massive ships. Now, they used these ships to transport fellow human beings as cargo in the Caribbean. So on one hand, we've got Lee's family, who owns a giant plantation, and on the other hand, we've got Tarleton's family, who is heavily involved in the slave trade. As young men, they both pursued secondary educations. Henry Lee attended New Jersey College, now known as Princeton University, with an interest in law. He graduated in 1773, but joined the Revolutionary War at the start of the conflict. When he arrived for the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in 1781, he was 25 years old. Banastre Tarleton started his college education and began to study law as well. He attended Oxford University, but he did not completely go through all of his courses, choosing to enlist in the army at the start of the war. When he arrived for the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, he was 27. Henry Lee would lead the 2nd Partisan Corps, which became known as Lee's Legion. Banastre Tarleton would lead the British Legion, often referred to as Tarleton's Legion. Now, both of these men did pick up some nicknames, but the establishment of these nicknames can be a little bit difficult to determine. Henry Lee is often called Lighthorse Harry Lee today, but we have yet to find sources from his life that actually use the nickname to describe him. While some did call him Harry, and others referred to him as Harry of the Light Horse, we have yet to find substantial proof of primary documentation where anyone before the 1830s called him Lighthorse Harry. That doesn't mean that it isn't true, but we would love to see some primary documentation if you yourself have seen some in any of your research. Similarly, Banastre Tarleton is often called Bloody Ban, a nickname that, again, lacks any primary documentation from Tarleton's life. It seems like the first major appearance of this token name was in Robert Bass's The Green Dragoon, published in the 1950s. Now, Tarleton still did have his share of catchy nicknames. He was often called the Butcher, and we believe there is proof that he was called Bloody Tarleton, but Bloody Ban itself has a lot less documentation. Again, that doesn't mean that it isn't true, but we haven't seen the proof yet. Now we're going to get into some of the tough stuff. Henry Lee, in February of 1781, participated in a massacre. Dressed similarly to Tarleton, he apprehended a party of loyalists under Dr. John Pyle. Conflicting reports paint different pictures of what happened next. Some claim that Lee lined his men up next to the unprepared and unsuspecting loyalists. Then he ordered a slaughter. Others claim that one of his troops initiated the fight. Yet others claim that the loyalists initiated combat once Lee's identity was revealed. Most sources discuss Lee's Legion beginning the combat, but regardless, utter chaos reigned as Lee's forces cut down these confused men. Many begged for mercy and shouted that they were on the same side, still believing that Lee was Tarleton. The event became known as Pyle's hacking match. The episode is confusing even today, but Lee and his men cut down between approximately 90 and 150 loyalists. Now, of course, Tarleton's massacre is going to be referring to the 1780 Battle of Waxhaws. Popular accusations do describe this as a massacre, although many scholars today debate that label. Reports on the battle tell different stories. Colonel Abraham Buford lined up his men in a single line to be run down by dragoons and ordered them not to fire until the very last possible second, a terrible strategy against the full force of cavalry charges. Additionally, Tarleton's horse was shot out from under him during the combat, leaving him unable to command for a portion of the battle where fighting became the most brutal. Fatalities were shocking. The battle became wartime propaganda. Henry Lee's men would later kill Loyalist prisoners, claiming Tarleton's quarter, referring to this massacre here, for their justification. While the Battle of Waxhaws, or Buford's massacre, was brutal and resulted in many deaths, Tarleton also called for medical care of the wounded and never personally ordered a massacre that we know of. In fact, he wrote to Buford ahead of time to ask for a surrender before the outbreak of violence. Buford refused and said he would fight to the last man. Now, this does not excuse either Lee or Tarleton's actions. Both participated in brutally violent conflicts that left dozens, if not hundreds, of casualties in their wake. However, Tarleton is remembered as a bloodthirsty killer who purposefully called for a massacre, and Lee's massacre does not receive as much attention, likely since it was against Loyalists. Now we're going to get into some of the juicier details of their lives outside of combat. Both of these men had very severe gambling addictions. Banastre Tarleton was obsessed with the card game Faro. Throughout his life, cards and betting were his fixations, and he would waste thousands of pounds in frivolous challenges. He became dependent on the charity of his family, and later his romantic partner of 15 years, Mary Robinson. While he would eventually find more financial stability later in life, his debts were nearly inescapable at points in his post-war career as a member of Parliament. Henry Lee could not stop his obsession with shoddy land speculation. Desperate to turn a profit on predicting the growth and development of new communities or real estate deals, Lee wasted thousands of dollars on terrible business transactions. The cavalry officer gambled away his family's land, lovingly called Leesylvania, over wasteful years of false promises and poor accounting. Lee lost over 30,000 acres, spent time in debtor's prison, and ruined his reputation with his in-laws, who adjusted his marriage agreement to protect their daughter's inheritance from his constant mismanagement. Lee nearly scammed George Washington himself. The cavalry officer offered to buy a horse from the president in exchange for a large amount of land. While the paperwork was processed, Lee sold the exact same land to someone else. Legal confusion over the property rights would follow for years. Both of these men also had very influential friends in high places. Lee's family was very close to the Washingtons and other high-standing members of society in Virginia. Tarleton was very close friends with the Prince of Wales. Now, the Prince of Wales would become King George IV. Both of these men would also deal with turbulent personal relationships with their partners. Now, Tarleton dated Mary Robinson for about 15 years, and sometimes this would be on and off. Sometimes the couple would call it off, and then there would be a rash of newspaper articles or magazine articles catching everybody up on the gossip about this high-profile couple. They would never marry, and eventually they would split after a nasty and bitter breakup filled with sad emotions over personal tragedies that I won't go into here. Truly, Banastre Tarleton and Mary Robinson's relationship could be an entire video on its own. But eventually they called it quits, and he would actually marry another woman later in life. Henry Lee would marry twice. His first wife was named Matilda. She was actually a cousin. And she was such a beauty at the time that she was called the Divine Matilda. Now, Matilda would suffer from severe health complications. We don't know what her illness truly was, but when this was paired with some severe childbirths, she would pass away. Lee's second wife, Anne Hill Carter, would eventually become a single mother of the period because Lee would become an absentee father. After destroying his family's finances through his land speculation, Lee would eventually find himself within debtor's prison for a year. There he would publish his account of the Revolutionary War. Now, his publication comes out 30 years after his experiences on the battlefield, so that's something to keep in mind when using his memoirs as a source. Banastre Tarleton also wrote an account of his time in the Revolutionary War, and it was published in 1787. His work is fairly self-aggrandizing, as is Lee's, and so their biases need to be considered when we view them as historical documents. Now, at this point in their lives, Tarleton is actually starting to settle down. He's married, he is living the good life, and he has a secure group of friends. He's started to gamble a little less, and he's become a little more level in his older age. On the flip side, Henry Lee is completely spiraling, and it is tragic. We need to think about how mental health care in this period likely affected these men's lives during and after the war. Lee struggled in his personal life. He later traveled to Baltimore, Maryland. There he rallied an unofficial militia to defend the home of a Federalist journalist. Lee was savagely beaten by an angry mob and never fully recovered. Nearly destitute, spurned by his family, and struggling with his failing health, Lee fled to the Caribbean for 5 years. He returned home with nothing but his broken spirit and died under the care of Nathaniel Greene's daughter, Louisa. Lee's wife refused to hear his last words. Anne Hill Carter had been left with several young children, including Robert E. Lee, who would never truly know his father. He would be 11 years old at the time of his father's death, and the last time he would have seen him was when he was 6. In fact, Robert E. Lee was nearly unable to wed his fiancée due to her father's dislike of the Lee family's troubled family situation and reputation. Banastre Tarleton died without any heirs. He received an official knighthood soon before his death, and while his reputation developed into something fierce in the United States, he passed out of public memory in England. Tarleton became a footnote in the story of King George IV's lavish lifestyle. How do you think the war affected these two men? Why do you think they acquired their respective reputations? If you could ask them a question, what would you want to know? Now again, this video was focused on the difficulties these men faced during and after the war. Both of them had moments of true bravery, courage, strength, and patriotism. I don't want it to sound like I'm attacking Henry Lee or that I'm trying to defend Banastre Tarleton, but it is fascinating to consider these historical figures as people and not these mythologized projections that we've come to know and associate with them so heavily. All of us are flawed individuals, just as those in the 1700s were flawed individuals. I hope that you took something away from this video and that you learned a little more about these two controversial figures of the American Revolution.